Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next lecture in the Architectures of Transition lecture series. My name, for those of you on Zoom, is Elisa Iturbe. I'm an assistant professor here at the Cooper Union. And it has been my pleasure to curate this year-long lecture series titled The Architectures of Transition. And this series is aimed at looking at how architecture has participated and can participate in civilizational transition, whether we're looking at the transition into a fossil economy or out of it, or whether we're looking at the transition into capitalism or out of it. It seems like architecture is always in the middle of the fray, and we need to understand that, both to understand the complicity of architecture, but also to understand what the possibilities are for us to participate in the coming changes in social and spatial form. So that's the groundwork, that's the context, and I'm very excited to welcome Professor Raymond Craib, who is the Marie Underhill Knoll Professor of History at Cornell University. He is the author of Cartographic Mexico, A History of State Fixations and Fugitive Landscapes. He's also author of The Craib Renegade, Politics and Poetry in Interwar Chile, and most recently, Adventure Capitalism, A History of Libertarian Exit from the Era of Decolonization to the Digital Age. And I'm very excited to welcome Professor Craib. I think his heterogeneous scholarship is really important. So a scholar who understands the processes of colonization all the way to these libertarian projects that seem to characterize the contemporary moment. And so I'm very excited to have him here because I think this is also important for us in a moment where we have to work to propose alternatives. And so the project of utopia is something that is sort of, there's a buzz around that. But of course, without a critical framework to think about this, there's no guarantee that we'll end up better off. So I think that this is an extremely important topic. I also wanted to say that I was first introduced to Professor Craib's work via his book, Cartographic Mexico, that recounts a spatial history of Mexican state making. And I think it's really an incredible account of a kind of spatial contestation that should be required reading for all who are interested in the relationship between space and power. So with that, I won't say more. I will give the stage to Raymond Craib. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Just bring this a little closer. We'll put that so. Okay. Here. Just a few minutes to get myself organized. So thank you. Thanks for being here, and I'm very grateful to Elisa for the invitation to speak. I'll give you my standard disclaimer, which is I'm not an architect or a historian of architecture. So I'm someone who's been interested in questions of geography, space, property, history. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I sort of blocked it. Sorry about that. Sorry, everybody on Zoom. But I've also been interested in questions of politics of various kinds. And so the stuff I've written on Chile is about young anarchists and university students in the early 20th century. And then more recently, a different kind of thing that really isn't anarchist, but people insist on continuing to call it anarchist. That is the Libertarian projects, which I'm going to talk about today. And I hope they have something to say about the questions of transition and also about thinking about carbon form and space and property and things like this. So Libertarian Noir, exit strategies and new enclosures. And so this is work I've been doing that's a history of libertarian advocates. And I'll explain what I mean by libertarian in a second, also by exit. But advocates who have sought to leave their country's citizenship and or residence, primarily the US, the UK, and the Commonwealth. I mean, these are where a lot of these folks are coming from, but not entirely, and to create their own private countries. Not just any country, but a country that's run as if it were a corporation or private business. And so there's a kind of tension here in these projects. On the one hand, they want to have something akin to sovereignty. And so if you look at the agreement from Montevideo in 1933 about what constitutes a state, you have to have certain kinds of things, a territory, a government, but you also have to have some kind of sovereignty. You have to be able to enter into diplomatic relations of some kind with other existing states in order to be characterized as a state. And yet at the same time, they're a strong critics of the state, not of government per se, but they want some kind of privatized territorial entity in some form or another. There's a long history of such projects, and so I'm going to start in our contemporary moment and kind of work backwards to give you a sense of this and to also try to emphasize why the history is important. And then you have tech-utopian libertarians today who want us to see it under the aegis of freedom. Freedom is the sort of central word in their kind of philosophy, not equality or other. So libertarian. What I mean by libertarian, I want to make sure to emphasize this. So these are people who are, you can see here, it has no relationship to anarchism, right? Anarcho-capitalism is a kind of term that people use often when designating some of these individuals. Fine, I don't like the term. I don't think anarchism and capitalism go together at all in any way, shape, or form. Anarchism has always been both against hierarchy and forms of bureaucratic state, but it's also always been anti-capitalist. And so, but sometimes when people talk about the libertarians I'm talking about, they do use the term anarcho-capitalism, so if that's helpful, there it is. These are individuals that are hyper-capitalist, range from, you can see here, someone like Murray Rothbard, who's often seen as the sort of godfather of US-style libertarianism. He had absolutely no patience for any kind of state whatsoever. He wanted everything, including things like military, national defense, police forces, and so forth, everything to be run through contractual relationships, market, private. He changed over time. By the 1980s, he became a backer of the sort of Reagan Revolution and Pat Buchanan and that kind of paleo-conservatism of that era, and he was supporting, police cracking down on people. Then you got people like Ayn Rand, who just never seems to go away, sadly, but very prominent in the 1950s, also in the 1960s, and someone who's kind of probably the most central ideological figure, intellectual figure in the group of people that I look at. They tend to focus on her work as a kind of middle ground between the sort of hardcore libertarian position of someone like Rothbard and then someone like Milton Friedman, who's the Chicago economist, who's most closely related to ideas of neoliberalism, right? But all of them, in some form or another, have a worldview here, which is basically a worldview in which they have a lot of disdain and no patience for the welfare or regulatory state. Right? This is the sort of basis of their critique. But there's variations then in terms of how they critique it. They are not opposed to the state per se, and this is really important to stress. What they want is what they would call, some might call a night watchman state, some might call a minimalist state, some might call it an ultra-minimalist state. There's a very prominent philosopher in the 1970s, Robert Nozick, who wrote Anarchy, State, and Utopia, in which he argued against other philosophers at the time about the liberal state, the welfare state, about questions of justice and equality, and suggested actually that the best means to achieve some of these things is actually through an ultra-minimalist state. Right? But the point here is that minimalism refers really to the range of the state's functions. It's not the size of its budget, it's not the size of the state. You can have an ultra-minimalist state with an absolutely outrageously bloated budget because of the size of its military or how much money it puts into the police force. When they talk about a minimalist state or night watchman state, they're usually talking about the classic aspects of state control that have been articulated by philosophers and political theorists in the 19th and 20th centuries, and that is you need to be protected from fraud, you need to be protected from direct violence, and you need to have some kind of form of protection of property right. These are the sort of central foci of a kind of minimalist state. So that's what its functions should be limited to those things in particular, and everything else is kind of extraneous to the state. It should be left to the market, however that might be construed. Right? Other things about these individuals, they have a kind of radical embrace of free enterprise. They essentially, at some level, want markets to be sovereign and states to exist to ensure the sovereignty of the market, rather than perhaps what we might live in today, maybe we don't, I'm not quite sure, in which states are sovereign and markets come under the state in some form or another. They fetishize the individual, not the social. So there's a lot of sort of, Robinson Crusoe kind of stuff in their rhetoric, in which you start off with the individual as the kind of beginning of social life, rather than the social itself, right? The individual only emerges historically over time out of the social world, rather than vice versa. Right? But they take as a given that the individual is the sort of starting point for thinking about political, social, economic life. Fear of the masses, especially for some of the individuals I've been talking about historically today, this is understandable because their own experiences with totalitarianism. And so, Rand is one example. Her family lost their property and their livelihood after the Bolshevik Revolution. Although she was also influenced by Hollywood and other places as well, not just by that experience, but others who had experiences either with the Soviet Union or especially with Nazi Germany during World War II. But over the course of time, what this yields is a conflation of communism, socialism, and fascism as equally similar forms of totalitarianism. This is pretty commonplace actually in the US after World War II, generally, right? The sort of mainstream American liberals tended to talk about totalitarianism. They tended to conflate fascism and communism in particular as a kind of a similar kind of thing. Right? And then the last thing is an ontology that equates individual private property rights with freedom. Private property rights are the foundation of what it means to be free in this kind of perspective that I'm talking about. Okay. What do I mean by exit when I talk about exit strategies? These are individuals who want to leave the nation state. Right? They want to create a new sovereign community. And I tried to emphasize at the beginning the meaning of sovereignty there, and to have it run entirely or largely along transactional market relations of some form. So everything in some form or another, with some exceptions, again, there's variation amongst the individuals, would be run through kinds of signed contract. For many of these individuals, so this is not just about tax havening, right? This is not just about trying to pay less and finding ways to hide your money. Many of the individuals I talk about have a lot of money, and they have enough money that they can hire a whole team of lawyers to move money around for them whenever they need to. They do not need to try to get into the business of building a new country. It's super complicated, it's super difficult. You have to find a location, which is very difficult because the planet's been parceled up. Basically, at least most earthly portions of the planet have been divided up already into sovereign states and so forth. So it's not merely about tax haven. For many of them, they see this as a kind of moral experiment. They see this as a kind of calling in which this is their way to pursue what they see as, or to realize the idea of freedom. So for them, the entrepreneurial and the moral are not mutually exclusive. Right? You engage in sort of capitalist relationships and sort of accelerate them, in fact, because it's a kind of moral thing to do in their mind. So exit is not only a means to an end, but it's also an end in and of itself. The right to opt in or opt out of societies with the ease of a consumer is, in some sense, part of what it means to be free. Again, this is my kind of summarizing or paraphrasing, and I'm sure some of them would disagree with my paraphrase and summary, but up there I don't. I focus on the 1960s to the present. There's a long history of private sovereignty plans and ideas that you could go back to Wakefield's plans for New Zealand. You could go back to The Man Who Would Be King by Rudyard Kipling. Gregor MacGregor, who was a Scottish investor who tried to create a kind of community off the coast of Honduras, on the Atlantic coast of Honduras in the 1820s. James Brooke in Sarawak, self-declared Raja of Sarawak. It's also the fact that, as Stephen Press has shown in a very nice book recently, that quite a bit of Africa in the 19th century, which we associate with a kind of colonial scramble for Africa, a lot of that scramble was private scramble. right, that then became subsequently legitimated in kinds of sovereign colonial contracts of various kinds. Why should you care about this history? One is because a lot of this stuff is around us today. There's very obvious things that might come to mind. Jeff Bezos with his famous rocket and program Origin, Elon Musk and his ideas about Mars colonization. You're getting the language of colonization, you're getting the language of Mars and space and the moon as entities available for private appropriation. Already, there's already debates going on in the Congress around whether or not you can actually make a claim, private claim, to some of these things. Questions around orbital colonization as well. Richard Branson, I'll just throw in another figure there who shouldn't be left out as well. You have other forms of exit that people talk about as well. AI, singularity aspirations, so Ray Kurzweil's text about uploading your consciousness into digital code into a computer. You also have Peter Thiel and others who've talked about longevity, right? Taking plasma from young people and injecting it into his bloodstream, or cryogenics, right? Having your body frozen and then pumped with something and reconstituted when the technology catches up in the future. There's a whole array of things like this. I'm not really interested in those. I'm really interested in the more kind of mundane territorial things, because those are the things that I think are very real and very immediate, and we can learn a lot from history about those things because of the way in which they function. But many of these are kind of billionaire vanity projects. We're a long way off from orbital colonization and things like this. It just takes too much labor on the ground to kind of keep somebody alive in space for any of this to kind of take off in any serious way anytime soon. Next week I'll probably be proven wrong, but anyway. So I'm more interested in the mundane and analog projects rather than the kind of digital projects. And two of the examples I'll give you are seasteading and free private cities, which I'll talk about in just a second. I mean, I did want to say another reason why I think the history of this is important is one is that these things, as kind of strange and wacky as they can seem, are not jokes. You know, really kind of do need to take them seriously. It's very easy to kind of dismiss them and laugh and also be completely insulted by them. But these are things that have real effects and consequences. They have real effects and consequences in the moment, but they also have long afterlives. So some of the historical projects I look at, and even these contemporary projects, even if they have no, and sometimes the advocates will admit this, they have no possibility of really coming to fruition. But that's not the point. What the point in part is that in the process of trying to bring them to fruition, other fissures open up, other avenues for profit making, expropriation, extraction, colonization open up. Other opportunities, other little things make their way into this. And I think that's the real kind of issue here that's important both in the past and in the present. Another reason these are important is because they're tested out in real places. Oceans, which despite efforts to kind of basically say the high seas are a legal sort of open area of colonization, is actually not the case. It's much more complicated than that legally, the status of the high seas and the open ocean. But they're especially tested out in places that I think in some ways we should think of as hyper-modern, but places that are not usually, when people talk about hyper-modernity or modernity, they usually don't think of Honduras. They don't think of Vanuatu or Tonga or Fiji. They don't think of Central America. They don't think of the island Caribbean in many instances. And yet these are the places where repeatedly these kinds of projects have been tested out. Going all the way back to, I mentioned Gregor McGregor in the 1820s in Honduras, William Walker in Nicaragua in the 1850s. I mean, the cycle can see again and again and again that there's certain places that are seen as opportune locations to test out these kinds of things. And the last thing I would say about why history is key here and why you should care about this history is because Silicon Valley, out of which many of these contemporary projects emanate, is not sui generis. Right? I mean, I think there's a kind of sense amongst many in Silicon Valley, certainly, that many of these things sprout, fully formed from the genius of themselves, and it's just not true. This is a lot of the stuff that's kind of updated primitive accumulation with a glossy patina. And I think if you kind of compare it, contrast it with what's come before, you can begin to see some of the kinds of ways in which these things are just iterations of earlier things. And of course, they use the language of colonization. And that's their word, often not mine. So both seasteading and free private cities, which are two of the examples I wanted to talk about, are things that are derived from or coming out of Silicon Valley's tech libertarian culture. These are exit projects, but they are inspired by a kind of Promethean desire to bend reality to one's will. And what I mean by this is not just about exiting, escaping, building a new country, living the way that you want to live, being left alone, all those kinds of things that sometimes sound commonsensical but are very, very problematic, particularly when you figure out how much money the federal government has given to Stanford University and so forth. It's the public's dime on which these things were built, frankly, not Elon Musk's investment strategy. But there's a kind of Promethean desire to bend reality to one's will. And what I mean by this is that a lot of the rhetoric around seasteading, for example, which I'll talk about in a minute, is that you create these new communities. And the idea is that as you compete for citizen consumers, that the impact of your new community will slowly force existing nation states to change their regulatory structures, to change their visa programs, to change their citizen status requirements, and so on. So the idea is not just to leave and withdraw. The idea is to generate something that's then going to have a kind of echo effect on existing nation states. Right? So they're inspired by a kind of more Nietzschean side of Ayn Rand. Right? Nietzsche had this enormous sort of sense of bending reality to one's will, and Rand famously embraced certain aspects of Nietzsche's Übermensch, or Superman. And you can see this in the current Silicon Valley projects like seasteading. They're very futuristic, but as I mentioned, they're analog rather than digital. They're still concerned about territory. They're still concerned about sovereignty and the like. These are, at some level, the next phases of a kind of neoliberal and libertarian revolution. Right? There's a lot of continuity here, and I want to make sure to emphasize that continuity. I don't think this is a sort of radical break at all in sort of what we've been experiencing since the 1970s, at least, if not earlier. And certainly, if you wanted to kind of think about some of the testing grounds for these things, you could do worse than look at a place like Chile after the coup d'etat in 1973, and the way in which Milton Friedman and the Chicago boys imposed a form of shock therapy, radical privatization on the country under military rule. But not merely social secession, right? But these are also forms of continued territorial secession. These are efforts to essentially scale up what we now have, private gated communities of various kinds, forms of homeowner associations, common interest developments, things like that, but also to actually then attach them to new forms of private sovereignty on ceded or quasi-ceded land. And then within these to have privatized services of various kinds, so a whole lot of different kinds of contracting, using economies of scale, and so forth. I mean, Mike Davis writes about this very eloquently in City of Courts for the case of Los Angeles. So what you end up with is not so much Thomas More's utopia, but maybe J.W. Marriott's hotel chain with some hefty political backing. Sci-fi visionaries, a lot of this, if you look at a lot of the sci-fi work of the 80s and 90s, you begin to see hints of all kinds of stuff like this. Neil Stephenson's work, Snow Crash, over here, William Gibson's Neuromancer, some of the work of Kim Stanley Robinson. But I think the person who's most kind of prescient or perceptive on this is actually J.G. Ballard in books like Supercons and Cocaine Nights, and Millennium People. He really began to explore this in the 70s and the 80s through fiction, but it's almost like an episode of Black Mirror reading J.G. Ballard. It's like he's just able to see past the horizon of sort of where we already uncomfortably feel like we are. And Supercon in particular, it's a pretty remarkable explication of some of the things that I'm talking about here. So seasteading, just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of seasteading? A little bit, okay, yeah. So yeah, let me give you a little bit of background. This is obviously not a real photographic background here, just to put everybody at ease, and never will be. But seasteading is, the basic premise here is to create private floating platforms on what they refer to as the high seas of the open ocean. And then we have to presume that there is something called the open ocean. It was started, seasteading began kind of formally in 2008 when Peter Thiel, famous Silicon Valley iconoclast, self-professed libertarian, but also makes an enormous amount of money off of the government with Palantir, which is a kind of surveillance system. Thiel gave the Seasteading Institute $500,000 as kind of startup money, and it was directed initially by Patrik Friedman, who's Milton Friedman's grandson. And the logo for the Seasteading Institute is Burning Man on the high seas. It's Burning Man, but like on top of a cruise ship with the ocean. Right? So the Burning Man is a big inspiration here. I don't have anything against Burning Man. I just, I'm not sure 7 days of sort of artistic self-expression in the Nevada desert can equate into a vision of a future society, especially when you think about the desert and the previous expropriations there historically as well from Native people. So they founded in 2008, they founded the Seasteading Institute. And the idea was to explore oceans or seas as places where you could try to create new countries, because there wasn't any place on land that seemed viable in which to do this. So there were efforts to interpret legal theory, to understand international law, and to figure out whether or not this was actually viable. There were efforts to deal with all kinds of engineering questions. You can't have a fixed platform because it's too deep on the high seas. And so you had to do something with ballast, floating. You have to think about how to deal with rogue waves, piracy, so on and so forth. The big problem, I think, for the Seasteading Institute, in part, has been much more basic, and that's labor costs, and the costs of social reproduction. For any of you who read Jules Verne, you might know there was a somewhat obscure Jules Verne book from 1895 called The Self-Propelled Island, in which he actually gives you this. It's an island. So Verne wrote a lot of his books as geography primers. That's why you get a lot of latitude and longitude. And so he turned them into adventure stories, but they were geography primers for French school students. And this is his primer for the island Pacific. And so the idea is that there's this artificial island, and it floats around the Pacific, and it goes from archipelago to archipelago, and sort of tells you a little bit about them and gives you latitude and longitude and so on and so forth. And so it's a geography primer for understanding the insular Pacific. But the interesting thing about it is the artificial island is populated only by a population of bickering billionaires. And they have to bring in the labor during the day and then send the labor home at night. And so it's 1895. It's very forward thinking. And it begins in San Francisco, which is also just, when I first read the book, I was like, this is kind of crazy. So labor costs, right, are really high amongst other things. Seasteading, in part, has been the founders or thinkers of seasteading have been influenced by a variety of different, I'd say, theoretical trends. One is the sovereign individual. This is a book that was written in 1997. James Dale Davison and William Rees-Mogg. Rees-Mogg, you might know the name because his son, Jacob Rees-Mogg, is one of the most outspoken Brexiteers in the UK now, was recently in the administration of Liz Truss. And if you watch actually what's unfolding in the UK right now, there's a lot of talk about things like free ports, charter cities. All of the upper administration in the UK right now, many of them came through the Institute for Economic Affairs, which was a kind of libertarian-inspired economic school, if you will. And so the sovereign individual is a kind of central text in a lot of the thinking that's actually complicating our world in a variety of ways right now. Also influenced a little bit by NRX, or neo-reactionary ideas. I don't know how many of you are familiar with people like Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, amongst others, but neo-reactionary ideas. Basically, in some sense, the premise here is that we have run our course with things like democracy and also certain aspects of capitalism. And so the premise is, you see here, neo-cameralism, neo-feudalism, but the idea is, in some sense, that democracy is a disaster, that the form of politics, representational politics that it embraces is very problematic, and that the influence of money in democratic politics is already so strong that let's just call it what it is, and that is that capitalists control the state. Right? It's the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. So let's just call it that, and let's go back to something like monarchy. Go back to something like feudalism. Right? There's a sort of neo-feudalist impulse here. If you know Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin, about right, the idea here being that essentially a commons, if people aren't careful, if they don't have mechanisms in place, the commons is just going to be overexploited, and everything is going to sort of fall apart. A very problematic argument on the part of Hardin, by the way. Here you're getting a sort of tragedy of the commoners, because the idea here in neo-reactionary politics and neo-feudalism is that democracy is you're putting a temporary person in place, and so they're going to basically extract as much as they can to their own benefit out of the system, and then they're going to leave before somebody else comes in. So instead, why not put in a monarch who's in for the long term, whose vested interest is going to be to look out for the well-being of everybody, right? It's a specious argument to say the least, but anyways, it sort of takes Hardin's arguments and applies it to political theory. And the last thing about the Seasteading Institute that I'll say is, recently what they've done is they've got a kind of ecological pitch, which is that seasteading can help climate refugees in the insular Pacific, in places like Tahiti, Kiribati, and elsewhere with rising sea levels. If you create these floating platforms, you can take refugees, people who would otherwise be displaced from their islands, and move them onto these platforms. It sounds great. I mean, there's a lot of questions, though. If you have a large floating platform, let's say that's tethered to a seamount, and Kiribati is overtaken by sea level rise, I mean, does the platform become Kiribati? Is the platform now leased by the government of Kiribati? Is Kiribati gone, and this platform is now the new private entity in the ocean? If it's estimated $5 million per single family platform, seastead, who's going to be taking climate refugees on a $5 million platform, and so forth? So a lot of questions kind of remain, and it's not easy to sort of get answers to these kinds of questions. This is seasteading's contemporary reality, not quite so glamorous as the last picture that you saw. Free private cities in Honduras is the other contemporary project I want to talk about, and then I'm going to shift gears. Let me just move over here. So, free private cities in Honduras, this is ongoing. It's had a bit of an interruption recently, but it was from 2010 up to 2021, it looked like a lot of these things were actually going to take off. This is clearly an image from someone who's opposed to charter cities, by the way, to cities. I'll talk about cities in a second. Charter cities, so the idea here came from, in part, from Paul Romer, who was an economist. He was chief economist at the World Bank briefly in, I think, 2018. He was an economist in Stanford, and I think he's now at NYU. But Romer's idea was that traditional forms of aid, international aid and so forth, have not really done much. They haven't resolved the kinds of things that they're intended to resolve. And so maybe what one might suggest or might do is to do something like charter schools, charter cities. So approach a government and negotiate with that government to cede a piece of its sovereign territory to a kind of international board of some kind, oversight board, maybe made up of representatives from other nation states, maybe made up of people from the private industry, maybe a mix of the two, but have them actually cede territory, sovereignty over the territory, to this group, and allow them to build essentially a kind of idealized version of Hong Kong, as it never was, right? The sort of nostalgia for Hong Kong is very, very pervasive here. And you could have sort of opt-in, opt-out. People sort of choose to live there or not live there. You wouldn't have voting rights or anything like this. You would sign a contract, and you would abide by whatever the rules are of the place. Whether that's, if it said you can't form a union, you can't form a union, right? And there's no voting. If you don't like the contract, you can always leave. Right? This was the idea. he explored this first in Madagascar, and there was a coup d'etat, and that brought his negotiations with the government at the time to an end. But at the very same time, there was a coup d'etat in Honduras. And that actually opened up a possibility for Romer to explore his ideas here. The basis for his ideas, you can see here, go back to Tybau's 1956 Sorting Manifesto, which was a sort of thought experiment about making where people live and the governance system that they live within, making it totally open like a consumer choice. Right? So you could just choose, if everything, Tybau was very clear, it was a thought experiment only. Right? But the idea was if all information was available to you, right? Everything possible, and there's no migratory controls whatsoever, absolutely zero migratory controls in or out, people would vote with their feet to go to different kinds of places. Right? This presumes a lot. It presumes that you have the money and the ability to move with your feet and the ability to go places. It presumes that there's no migratory controls. It presumes, like game theory does, rational choice theory, that you have all the panoply of options available to you with complete transparency in front of you. None of those things actually appear in the law. Even for Romer, he understood that some kind of migratory controls would have to be in place in an opt-in, opt-out situation. But here's the basic premise, right? Ceding a sovereign territory to a kind of international board. In the case of Honduras, few aspects of the Honduran constitution would apply. There would be an autonomous police and judiciary. These would be places that would not be subject to the democratic will of the Honduran populace, and potentially there would be no extradition treaty. This was quite attractive to some of the individuals in Honduras involved in this because of their connections to narco trafficking, and more recently the United States actually has got some of these individuals sent to the U.S. These turned into, charter cities over time, turned into what are called ZEDEs, economic development zones, or exclusive economic and employment development zones. And a whole number of them were getting tested out in Honduras in various places. And there was enormous backlash and protest to this, as you can imagine. There were no quote-unquote empty spaces in which to try these out. And so it meant taking land, sometimes from traditional communities, indigenous communities like the Garifuna and others in Honduras. And the ZEDEs were passed by the Congress and by the Supreme Court after some pretty shady interactions. And a whole array of people begin to come to Honduras and start to explore possibilities. Patrik Friedman, who I already told you about, the Seasteading Institute, Michael Strong, I think he calls himself a radical social entrepreneur or radical social visionary. I can't remember exactly right, but he's got a name for himself. He passed a law called Strong's Law, and then he also passed a corollary to his own law, Strong's Corollary. So he thinks highly of his idea. Ex-Reagan officials, many of these are individuals who cut their teeth in Central America in the wars of the 1980s, brutal wars that actually put huge numbers of people from Central America on the move to the United States in many cases. Grover Norquist, famous anti-tax pledge figure. Mark Klugman, who was a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, also worked with Jose Piñera on his campaign in Chile. Piñera was part of Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile. Mark Skousen was an international investor and someone associated with the Reagan administration. Faith Milsey Jr. recently passed away, who was head of one of the heads of the public affairs office that the Reagan administration had, which was intended to basically put a good face on how the wars in El Salvador and Nicaragua were going. And then you also have an international conservative libertarian network that's involved in some of these projects called the Atlas Foundation, which is dispersed around the globe. And it's got a very prominent presence in Brazil, in Chile, in the United States, Canada, the UK, and elsewhere. Right? So these are the individuals involved in these. I'll just tell you very quickly, over the course of basically from 2010 to 2021, you had a coup government in charge in Honduras. Elections were held, but the elections were often fraudulently constructed to ensure the maintenance of the coup in power, the coup regime in power. So these things were going forward. So this was the kind of government in which people were negotiating with in order to kind of put these things into place. Romer pulled out in 2015 because of a lot of the shenanigans that he saw going on with various groups coming down. So Romer had a kind of idealistic vision of what this might look like, and then eventually saw that it was going someplace that he didn't want it to go, and so he left. In 2021, there was elections were held, and the man who had been overthrown in the coup d'etat in 2009, his wife was elected president. She has now put these things on hold. There's one that does seem to be going forward. This is on an island, the Bay Islands off the coast of Honduras. It's not entirely clear what's going to happen with Roatan Prospera. At this point, it's 58 hectares of land, or 58 acres, a 58-acre footprint. The likelihood, I would imagine, at this point is that it's going to be a kind of tech-gated community, but I doubt it's going to have ceded sovereignty or anything like this. I don't think it's going to be a ZA at this point, but they're fighting this, they're disputing this, and they're trying to have it adjudicated. You can see the advisory board is all men, famed architect Patrik Schumacher, who's got a very interesting sort of, I think he actually calls himself an anarcho-capitalist, if I'm not mistaken, but certainly has a very kind of anarcho-capitalist orientation. Paul Critchlow, the former vice chairman of Bank of America and Merrill Lynch. Joel Baumgar, Mississippi congressman, Marxist social conservative, also opposed to abortion rights for women. The consul general for the Netherlands and Honduras. You can see on trade lawyer, lobbyist Shankar Singham, who was deeply involved in the Brexit negotiations as well. So you can see the linkages between formal state politics that are happening in parts of the world and the involvement of individuals here now trying to generate these new kinds of states as well. Right. Where this, so like I said, where this stands right now is not entirely clear. So all of this is not new. I just want to talk a little bit about what history shows us. There are other ongoing projects that you should learn about, in my opinion, and kind of think about. One thing I want to mention about seasteading very quickly is, in terms of thinking about the carbon form and some of the things that are part of the series that this lecture is a part of, and the exhibit that's coming up is. Part of these, the seastead idea is radically individualized, right? The idea is that you would have a single family or single person platform that could actually move and attach and detach, right? So you could find communities of interest amongst other seasteaders, and you could attach because you all share similar kinds of ideas or similar kinds of aspirations or whatever. But you could also detach if you wanted to opt out, right? But there's no public space here. There is no such thing as the public. Right? These are all, it's all about single kinds of entities that detach and detach. So it's a fundamentally sort of private property living space, but one that connects you up to a kind of global digital network, right? Sort of telecommuting and so on and so forth that we saw sort of scale up during the pandemic. Okay. So there are other ongoing projects you could learn about. Balaji Srinivasan's network state. The idea here with the network state is cloud first, land next, last. So his idea is you create cloud communities first, communities of interest via the internet. And over the course of time, as your communities of interest grow and develop, you start to find nodes. So let's say you decide to go in on a co-op together in a city, or you find a location where you can all kind of live together in the same neighborhood or something like this. But then you slowly begin to develop these things out to the point where eventually you can have some kind of territorial entity. But then it starts with the cloud and then it moves forward to land. You can read it online. It's called the network state. It's his effort to sort of circumvent some of the things that have been problematic and some of these other things over time in terms of finding territory. I mentioned already the UK and the Truss government. Now, of course, her successor is carrying on similar kinds of ideas from the Institute for Economic Affairs. But I want to turn to history because I just want to give you a sense of some of these examples from the 60s and 70s because they reveal to us some of the kinds of continuities with our own world. So just like we're living through an era of climate catastrophe, we're living through an era of debate around sort of monetary change, cryptocurrencies, digital currencies, and the like. and so forth. You can see here the 1960s, the 1950s and 60s are also an era in which this is space talk, going down outer space, Mars, and so on and so forth, right? But demographic, ecological, or monetary collapse. So you have huge debates in the 1960s around population, right? And that the Earth is somehow or another quickly approaching capacity. So I already mentioned Garrett Hardin's The Tragedy of the Commons, which was a kind of response to this, and then he would eventually write about what he called lifeboat ethics, which was a very problematic idea of who belongs in the lifeboat and who doesn't. Population bomb, it says Paul Ehrlich here. He wrote it with his wife, Anne Ehrlich. Her name doesn't appear there. So Paul and Anne Ehrlich's population bomb, which was filled with quite outrageous scenarios about what might happen in the future. And underneath it all sat a kind of anti-communist concern. But really, this idea that there was going to be a demographic collapse approaching very quickly. And so you also have ecological kinds of concerns. I mean, Dune, Frank Herbert's Dune was serialized starting in 63 or 65. Harry Harrison's Make Room, which was published in 1964, was the basis for a movie called Soylent Green with Charlton Heston in 1973. Right? So you know Soylent Green, everybody thinks that there's, by the way, Soylent Green 2022 is when it's supposed to take place. It comes out in 1973, but people are eating little green capsules that are supposedly made by this company that are plankton, but it turns out that they're human corpses. But that's based on this book, right? So, and then you also have fears of monetary collapse, right? So you have a huge concern after World War II around gold, the gold standard, and this is a moment when libertarians are embracing the language. They come to be called gold bugs. They're going on TV shows telling you you should invest in metals. Right? Still to this day, it's super common. Right? You should buy gold. You should buy silver. Fleming's Goldfinger, right? James Bond is battling Auer. Right? Auer is the Latin word for gold. Auer Goldfinger, because he wants to destroy the economy by irradiating all of the gold supply, which backs up the monetary system located in Fort Knox. And so the idea is you bring down empire right, through monetary collapse. And then you can see a little advertised up here by someone I'm going to talk about in a second, Mike Oliver. Again, right? Have you made your security investment against the coming monetary collapse? This stuff was everywhere. Right? This idea that we were on the edge of ecological, demographic, and monetary disaster right? was approaching. Right? And it's also, of course, the era of decolonization and the Cold War, right? Which is very important because of the concerns around the spread of communism in decolonizing countries, but also the idea that decolonizing countries can be places where you can go and experiment with these new forms of political life. So it's often the dawning of the age of Aquarius, but the 1960s was also the dawning of the age of Atlantis. Atlantis was the kind of preferred reference point for libertarians at the time. They were always talking about Atlantis. Atlantis this, Atlantis this. And I can use some examples. Lester Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway's younger brother, tried to create new Atlantis in the Caribbean in 1964. He built a little balsa wood raft and he attached a Ford engine block to it and he sunk it off the coast of Jamaica. And he declared his own little country. And he even created currency and he created postage stamps and things like this. It didn't last very long because a hurricane came through and took it out. Werner Stiefel. Stiefel was a pharmaceutical engineer originally from Germany, based in upstate New York. I think he was soap engineer. Buckminster Fuller, he had a what's it called, the dome, geodesic dome. He had a geodesic dome outside of a motel, the Socrates Motel, off of I-87 in upstate New York, on the way to Albany. And they had a geodesic dome where they built, he and his libertarian backers built a little ship, and they were going to sail it down to the Bahamas, and they were going to slowly in stages build a new country in the Caribbean. They set sail, the boat caught fire, it sank, they dredged it out, they rebuilt it. They were very persistent, they went back down the Hudson, they got down to the Caribbean, and then a hurricane came and wiped it out. Right? That was also going to be called Atlantis. Werner Stiefel. That was 1968, 1969, 1970. But the most persistent effort is by a man named Michael Oliver, who I write a lot about. He was born in Brzezinski in Lithuania in 1928, Jewish. All of his family were killed in the Holocaust. He was the only survivor at the age of 18. Came to the States after the war, after 2 years in a displaced persons camp, and ended up in Nevada, where he had a coin exchange selling gold and silver, which was not easy to do in the 1960s because of the controls around gold and silver. And also was a land developer. And in 1968, he was worried about totalitarianism in the United States. He didn't like what he was seeing, the street conflict and so forth. And he wrote a little manifesto called A New Constitution for a New Country. And the idea here was to essentially to build a constitution that people could subscribe to and agree to and leave and build a new country, and the country would be exactly the one that I was just mentioning to you earlier, totally run along market relationships and so forth. He made 3 efforts to do this. The first was just like the seasteaders now, right? The first one was on the ocean. And Oliver and his backers, he had a number of very wealthy backers. Oliver is the most out front figure in these, but he had a lot of wealthy backers who are some of the names you might know: John Templeton Foundation, which supports NPR. If it's NPR, they'll say, we've got money from the Templeton Fund. John Templeton, he was a real estate investor, Wall Street investor, and others, a magnate, the wheat magnate from Wichita Falls, amongst others. So they identified first the Minerva Reefs. The Minerva Reefs that's Tonga, there that you see. The southernmost island in Tonga is Ata, right there. And there's the Minerva Reefs. So you're looking basically between Tonga and New Zealand, right, on the map. These are reefs that are basically underwater 23 hours out of the day, and about 50 minutes out of the day they're above water. And the idea here was how to make it permanently above water so that it's an island and to lay claim to it, right? Because no one else, in theory, has a claim to it. Hired a dredging vessel, dredge sand from the lagoon, pile it on top of the reef, and then the premise was take coral, encapsulate it in chicken wire, fill it with concrete, build a platform that would eventually expand to house up to 30,000 people. Not ecologically especially nice. They got a little ways into the project, not very far, before the King of Tonga decided that this should not be going on. There's a number of reasons why this was the case, not just about sort of political jurisdiction or something like this, but also things like fishing rights, seasonal usufruct, right? So Pacific Islanders have laws over seasonal use rights in various places that are outside of their political economic zone, or political zone. And then also it turned out that there were Tongans who had been buried on the reefs when there had been an accident in 1962, a shipwreck in 1962. A lot of support from the Southwest Pacific nations like Fiji and others to essentially put an end to this project, because they were very worried that libertarians would come and do this on other seamounts. There's lots of seamounts in the Southwest Pacific. And so they were very worried about this. So this came to an end in 1972. This is a coin that Michael Oliver made to commemorate what he thought was the founding of Minerva. He did a second project. He did a second project in the Bahamas in 1974 and 1975. This is a project that's a little more disturbing because, they're all disturbing in some way, but this one's a little more disturbing because you see the involvement of you can see the ways in which a kind of noir world, right, so the shady underground world, can very quickly find its way into a lot of these kinds of projects, right? And so here was a case in which Oliver and his backers were attempting to support a secessionist movement in the islands in the north. You see Little Abaco and Great Abaco in the north of the Bahamas there. The Bahamas was slated to become independent in 1973, and the inhabitants of Abaco wanted to stay part of the United Kingdom. They didn't want to leave for independence. There's a number of reasons why that was the case, not least of all among them the question of race. They didn't want to be subject to a predominantly black government that would inherit independence in 1973. And so Oliver and his backers helped to try to foment a secessionist movement there. And I'm showing you some of the individuals involved here. The man with the cigar up top is a guy by the name of Mitchell Livingston Werble III, by the name. Mitchell Livingston Werble III did a lot of different things. He ran a paramilitary training camp outside of Atlanta called the Psionics Cobra Warfare School. But he's most famous because of that gun. And that gun is the Ingram MAC-10. It's the deadliest repeating pistol that was made in the 20th century. It could fire up to 700 rounds a minute. And he built the silencer for the Ingram MAC-10. If you watch 3 Days of the Condor with Robert Redford, Max von Sydow is carrying an Ingram MAC-10. If you watch The Q with John Wayne, he plays a Seattle cop. He's carrying an Ingram MAC-10. If you watch The Wire, they reference the Ingram MAC-10. The Ingram MAC-10 is everywhere. It's everywhere. It's a very famous weapon. Werble was a little kind of mechanical genius when it came to creating sound suppressors or silencers. And he made the silencer for the Ingram MAC-10 amongst many other things. Right? And so he wanted to get into the Abaco project because of weapons manufacturing. So he was involved along with Oliver. This man is Andrew St. George, who's a journalist who covered a lot of this stuff. He was with Castro prior to the arrival in Havana for the Cuban Revolution in 1959. So this is Andrew St. George up in the hills in 1958 with Castro. And the person who took this picture using Andrew St. George's camera was Che Guevara. He actually took this photograph. And then that's Michael Oliver up there, and that's the land document that they were going to put together to get people to embrace this kind of privatized secessionist movement. This didn't go well either. The FBI, a lot of the information I have is from FBI records. The FBI was investigating and pursuing them and so forth. And so, in fact, things kind of fell apart quite quickly. Werble was being investigated by the Congress. If you Google Mitchell Livingston Werble, put aside a few weeks to go down a very, very bizarre rabbit hole that includes JFK's assassination, marijuana running from Central America, and like a whole array of other stuff. And you can see why conspiracy theories take off when you look at his track record. So then he tried one last place. Oliver was persistent with some other, again, very prominent backers. And this was in the New Hebrides in Santo Island, back to the Pacific Southwest. This is now Vanuatu. At the time, it was called the New Hebrides. And here, Oliver and his backers allied themselves with the man in the white T-shirt there up at the top, Jimmy Stevens. Jimmy Stevens was a chief from the northern island of Santo. New Hebrides had been colonized by the English and the French. And again, it was decolonizing in the 1970s. Independence was slated for 1980. And again, what they tried to do here was to take advantage of some internal dissent, internal conflict between Jimmy Stevens and his francophone backers and the anglophone kind of intellectual political class who were really at this point looking like they were going to lead the movement for independence. And so Stevens is thinking about how can we have a kind of confederation that separates out from the New Hebrides, right? This is very common during the era of decolonization, which is you don't have to just think about nation states. You can think about confederations. You can think about a whole array of other kinds of political possibilities, not just nation states. And so they're trying to capitalize on this. And in the end, you can see this is the passport that they put together, right, with the white hand and black hand shaking. And in the end, a rebellion broke out in 1980, and it led to the displacement of a couple thousand people. Jimmy Stevens had a son who was shot and killed. He ended up in prison. A couple of his allies also ended up in prison where they died shortly after entering prison. So it had this traumatic effect on Vanuatu. And even today, if you go to Vanuatu, the name of Michael Oliver, the name of Jimmy Stevens is everywhere. It's a very resonant memory. And at this point, Oliver stopped his project. So I just want to, let me just give you a few conclusions here. I mean, I raise Oliver because it's important to have this sense of how these things unfolded in various places over time and the kind of innate, oftentimes undercurrent of violence that could run through them, right? And the kinds of characters who could become involved in these projects and look for possibilities in various ways. I mean, it's not surprising you have mercenaries involved, right? I mean, these are libertarians par excellence. I mean, they're privatized armies fighting in the name of capitalism. If you read The Dogs of War by Frederick Forsyth, 1974, Forsyth's book, in theory, right, is a novel about mercenaries toppling a government in an unnamed African country. But if you read the book, there's no real action until the very end, because the vast majority of the book is a primer about how to do it. How you move money, where to move money, how to secure your tracks, how to get weaponry across borders. I mean, it's a kind of primer for this stuff. He was a journalist who covered a lot of these things. Okay, just very quick, I'll wrap up here. Speculative nonfiction. So this is a kind of, it's thinking about speculation and futures in both the economic sense and the imaginative sense. A kind of new era of neoliberal privatization, grifter venture capitalism, and climate change prepping, right? From bunkers to private islands to outer space and so forth. Libertarian states is not a contradiction, something I tried to mention earlier. And then you have the question of who gets to exit. Because the people I've been talking about thus far are people with the resources, the economic resources and the clout to be able to exit. So who has the right to exit? And also there's the question of who has the right to remain. In the case of Honduras, you have people exploring a second or third version of sovereignty for themselves in a place where huge numbers of the population have been put on the move and made effectively stateless. And they come to the border of the United States where they're separated from their children. It's kind of grotesque, to be honest. I mean, you're making people stateless in the places where you are giving yourself a third, fourth, fifth state option. Exit is expensive for both those who buy in and those who cannot. So in the 60s and 70s, these new country projects created a lot of economic and political turmoil in places that were trying to decolonize. They were trying to break free from the yoke of colonial rule, and you have a new wave of colonizers moving in. And then today, technologies for grandiose projects are dependent on extractivism and extrusionism and on the carbon modernity, which further damages the planet on which the rest of us and those who come out after us to live. So private exit essentially outsources its cost onto the public. Ecological costs, political costs, and all of us have to kind of bear these as well. And the add, as you can see, is the cumulative debris of what people call the social advocacy, right? The ways in which humanity has impacted geological change. And again, to emphasize, exit promoters, they benefit from taxpayer subsidies, they benefit from corporate welfare, they benefit from international free trade agreements that restrict efforts at climate change mitigation. There are projects that are embedded in carbon modernity or carbon reform, that is the subject of this lecture series. They are projects of exclusion and elitism that embrace and accelerate capitalist modes of extraction and production. And one of the places that I haven't talked about here, that one can certainly talk about more, is the question of cryptocurrencies, NFTs, and the like. And again, this is happening in Puerto Rico, and it's happening in Honduras. El Salvador has adopted Bitcoin as a currency. I mean, it's not a currency, right? It's a speculative investment. It's not a currency at this point. And also Vanuatu. You have Satoshi Island, named after the supposed founder of Bitcoin, now in Vanuatu. So anyways, and then you have forms of green grifting and the like. And then my last slide, just to finish up, thanks for your patience. Exit's not a neutral act. So Mike Davis, who recently passed away, the only realistic scenario in which climate change is addressed equitably, such that the worst consequences are not borne by the poor and future generations to come, is one in which the wealthy do not have, in his words, a preferential exit option. So it's not an argument for hardening national borders. This is not meant to be a defense of the state or the nation state. It's not about political containment of the populace or restriction of movement. Right? And it's not even an argument against exit per se. The crux of the argument is not the term exit. The crux of the argument is the term preferential. And that's the issue, which highlights the dramatic inequities and the possibilities for consequences of exit. So the last point here, right? Preferential exit under unequal conditions, not denying withdrawal, autonomy and self-government, but it's a continuation of a long history of class warfare by other means. Okay, and I think I'll stop there because you've been very patient with me, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thanks. I'll go back.
So I'll just come up and join you for a second
Sure.
and ask one or two questions, and then we'll open to the audience.
Sure.
So first of all, thank you. So interesting and scary and fascinating all at the same time. And so I think I have maybe one question that's more directly about your research, and then maybe more about looking forward, like kind of a where we go from here question. But I'm interested in the seasteading in particular, because there are obviously so many relationships between seasteading, homesteading, colonization, right, like our own imaginary there. But at the same time, there have to be ways in which we have to find new modes of self-sufficiency in order to reduce our dependency on global supply chains. So like there's this very delicate balance between kind of trying to sever ties from a kind of globalized, fully integrated infrastructure, and then trying to create more self-sufficiency, self-determination, more autonomy, which is an important political project in some ways, given that we're under the yoke of this very heavy capitalist system that reduces our self-determination. But so I'm interested to hear your opinion maybe on that dichotomy around self-sufficiency, and how, like, when it's almost like when you bring up self-sufficiency, our imaginary immediately goes towards this kind of project, or towards a kind of prepper situation where like you build the bunker and you have enough food for 20 years, right, and like security cameras above ground, and you know that kind of situation. And I think that obviously that seems to me too simplistic of an idea of what self-sufficiency looks like, and I think that comes in part from our lack of imagination stemming from having existed for so long within systems of private property, right? It's almost like we can still only ever imagine ourselves within the constraints of property. So I was wondering if you could perhaps speak to that a little bit, especially relative to, with the seasteading, this idea of a new ground, and the new ground seeming to be the potential to produce all of these new political conditions, but at the same time, it still seems totally subservient to the idea of property. It's simply like a new parcel, right? Kind of relocated to give a little bit more leeway in some aspects. But there were some moments where I thought, well, why don't they just buy a big plot of land somewhere? Right. Why does it have to be the ocean? And so I guess my question is, I'm asking a couple of things at once, but maybe mostly this question of like, how should we think about self-sufficiency also relative to these kinds of projects? And is our inability to look past property part of the problem?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And I do think, there's a kind of, I don't want to say a constraint on the imagination, but I do think it is hard to kind of think past not only property, but also the nation state in some ways. And so I do feel like this is why I was referencing a lot of different sci-fi, because I like the importance of imagination at some level. Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting in some sense. I mean, when I finished a lot of the work that I was doing on this, or the version of it that you've seen, it occurred to me that actually in some ways it could feel like a very conservative argument, right? That essentially, right, a sort of status quo argument or something like this, or like I said in the talk, kind of defense of the nation state, which is not necessarily what I wanted it to be. And certainly the kind of counterexamples one could call from the historical record and pay some attention to, are worthy of talking about. A variety of, think about the Zapatistas of southern Mexico and kind of autonomous territories and their efforts to construct a different kind of set of social relations, economies, things like this. There's Rojava, the Sami in northern Scandinavia, right? These are movements for self-determination and autonomy that don't take national liberation form, and so they take a kind of different approach than what we might have seen in sort of classic era decolonization after World War II, and also, of course, after the French Revolution and American Revolution, Asian Revolution as well, sort of first wave of decolonization. And then there's sort of broader ways of thinking about different ways in which people have looked at and thought about self-sufficiency that is not built first and foremost through a property paradigm, or at some level, or doesn't at least have the kinds of political aspirations, the sort of dramatic political aspirations that these projects have. The thing that is interesting to me about these projects is that ultimately there's not much here in my mind that's about self-sufficiency. They're completely wedded to commodity chains. They're completely wedded. I mean, they're sort of, doubling down on a certain kind of property paradigm. But there's a sales pitch involved that I think it can be attractive about things like sustainability, things like dealing in green ways with climate change and the blue economy, and it can be very attractive because I do think there's a lot of desire for a whole array of alternatives, but I think embedded in these is not the kind of solution that one would want to look for, and I think that's where my my jadedness with these and the sort of strong critique I make of them comes from. But it's true. There's the kind of the flip side of possibility, right? Of thinking about other forms of self-sufficiency, getting out of a certain kind of property paradigm, also is something that should not be undercut simply because these seem to be taking up a lot of the oxygen in the room.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Doug Spencer has a great essay on Bjarke Ingels' Oceanics project. And he essentially makes that argument. He's like, this is saying this is an eco-utopia, but honestly, like, it is so integrated into capitalist modes of production that, like, there's no way in hell, right? And then he talks about how architects actually use their ability to create seductive images to give the sense that this is ecological. And the imagery produced by architects does actually the work of obscuring conditions of labor, the same paradigm of relegating other lands and people elsewhere to some kind of subjugation so that the person can have their nice little walk down the promenade, etc.
I think I might be mistaken about this, but I think the first firm that the seasteaders worked with was Delta Sink out of the Netherlands, who'd done a lot of social housing on the water. And so this seemed to me like quite a sharp shift in some sense for that company, and they did a lot of the sort of visual imagining. Some of the images for seasteading that you can look at from early days, I think, was put together by Delta Sink, and it does that. It has this kind of, it all looks very blue and very green and very lush, very, clean, no pollution. The fish are happy. And I'm not entirely like there's an architect based out of or a company based out of Japan that was doing something kind of, I can't remember the name, but a kind of lily pad version of sort of seasteading, but it wasn't seasteading in that it didn't bring the ideology with it. It was about how do you actually interact with whatever state that might be to figure out how this might work and how you might make it feasible financially. How you might work with various nonprofits and the UN, so it was like thinking about it still in a very sort of mainstream way, but not in a way that kind of sells something that's completely, to my mind, devastating at some level.
Well, it seems like a lot of it is about the notion of ground, right? And so I guess maybe another question I would have for you before turning to the audience is like, is the problem the platform, or is the problem the ideology of privatization? Which seems like you kind of just answered it, that it's kind of the ideological framework that is the issue, not, because if we think about it spatially, and as architects, I think often we're trying to think about what is the kind of spatial configuration that we can inject in it, but the spatial configuration itself often doesn't have a politics that's associated with it, right? So we have to attend both, no?
Yeah, so it's the content more than the form, I would say. Although I have mixed, there are days where I go back and forth about this, but the content is central, right? And I think this is why I wanted to distinguish at the outset, libertarianism from the kind I'm talking about, from anarchism or anarcho-communism or syndicalism, because it's the content that's much more so than the form. You can imagine a variety of kinds of exit possibilities that are, even the Zapatistas, they have a recognition that they're always in a kind of barter relationship, some kind of bargaining relationship of some kind, right, with the Mexican state. And they're not a complete repudiation of the Mexican state. They're the repudiation of the Mexican state that has been completely, enveloped by sort of Wall Street and international finance and austerity measures. And so it's much more the content to me that I think is what worries me. I mean, the form. I think there are relationships between form and content, but in the specifics of this, it's the ideological content that I think is most worrisome to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me open to the audience. Are there any questions? We can also take questions from the Zoom, which will come from the back if we have any.
Sure. Thank you so much for the talk. That's really super provocative.
Thank you.
My question is, and I'm just reading this text, you touched on it at the end with the cryptocurrencies, but how do you see this intersecting with generally like the Web 3.0 in terms of blockchain technologies and the ability of different kinds of smart contracts in terms of governance, or opportunities to decentralize? So yeah, how do you bring those two things together? Because it seems like, besides the form and content, there is a kind of right moment here for these two things to intersect with each other. And I'm just wondering.
I'm not the best person to kind of talk about the sort of cryptocurrency side of things because it's something I'm still learning about. But I can, if I understand your question correctly, I mean, the thing that comes to mind is, so I was back in Vanuatu in December and giving a talk about the Vanuatu specifics of this book. And one of the people that I met there and had a long conversation with is a young man who's doing exactly this. He's using blockchain technology, but he's using it and for precisely the reasons you're mentioning, right? Which is both sort of improved local regional governance and also kind of decentralized governance. But he wants nothing to do with crypto, right? So it's like separating blockchain completely out from crypto. And it's really, for me, like I was just sitting here listening to him talk, and it took me a while to kind of catch up or to feel like I caught up to where he was. So I think that's absolutely right, and I do think there's these other pathways that are clearly possible, and at some level they're struggling against. I mean, one of the things he mentioned to me was he's struggling against the tide of suspicion about blockchain because it always seems to be associated with cryptocurrencies. And in Vanuatu now, I mentioned there's this Satoshi Island. I mean, they issued like 21,000 NFTs, and if you buy an NFT, then you get citizenship. But it's not really citizenship because they don't have authority to issue a passport, and you still got to go through Vanuatu customs, and then they say you're going to have land. And of course, you can have land because in Vanuatu, land is owned in custom. You can only have leasehold. So, but a lot of this kind of sales stuff, I mean, there's a lot of these characters in Puerto Rico as well. And so, but the blockchain crypto connection gets accentuated over and over again. And he was saying that, the struggle for him is to get people interested in listening and not thinking that he's involved in these kinds of essentially kind of land grabs, right? Yeah. Thank you.
What, in your view, could be seen as the most promising or positive aspect of these projects?
Prominent or positive aspects of the projects. I take a negative view. It's true. I guess a cynical view might be a way to put it. Well, I could move around the question in perhaps an unfair way and say that maybe one positive view of the projects is the realization by many that for all the problems we have with the state, like the state is still important. And so maybe these are kinds of things that will make people remember that that the state's important. And I mean, it does feel like for 30 years we've been living in a sort of increasingly libertarian mindset in some ways. I mean, even in the historical profession, you read history books, and everybody has agency now. Peasants have agency. Everybody has agency, except bureaucrats. Bureaucrats are still cogs in the machine. They're still inefficient. They're still, apparatchiks. And yeah, I kind of disagree with that. I think we actually need to, not be so negative about bureaucrats, and we need to think about the state differently. Maybe the wheels turn, because now all of a sudden, I never thought this would happen in my lifetime, but now all of a sudden we've got people in the U.S. upset about communism again. I never thought anybody would be upset about communism again. I thought we were done with that. And so maybe the wheels turn and people are recognizing, right, that the state is fundamental. And so, to be fair to the spirit of the question, you could imagine, I think, ways in which these might inspire different kinds of forms of exit that are unlinked from the ideological content related to them. I will say the seasteaders, in their defense, say this, right? They say they do not have an ideological position vis-a-vis what any of these exit seastead communities might look like. The problem is that they start from the premise of private property to begin with, right? So they do have an ideological project right from the outset. And so that's my, the disconnect is there. But they, in theory, want to articulate that these are projects where, all kind, let 1,000 ideologies bloom idea. But the starting premise for them is doesn't allow for that, is part of my perspective, right? It's deeply anti-statist at the outset and very hyper-capitalist at the outset. Thank you for the question.
It's regarding your disposition towards anarcho-capitalism as a term, and I was wondering, and I guess most of this lecture was describing libertarian viewpoints on exit strategies, and I didn't hear much about anarcho philosophies, like relative to that.
You mean like anarchist philosophies?
Yeah. The lecture started off by you opposing anarcho-capitalism as the description of it, and explaining why it's libertarianism. And I was wondering if you can perhaps talk about relationship to anarchy or the structural differences as you see them in anarchies or just general.
Sure. Yeah. I think the sort of essence of what I wanted to get to with anarcho-capitalism is, I can give you a kind of concrete example and then maybe abstract out from it a little bit, but HBO Max did a documentary recently called The Anarchists. And it's problematic for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that it's a kind of misrepresentation of anarchist politics, right, in general, right? So, thinking of anarchism as a politics that is deeply suspicious and opposed to hierarchy, right, and forms of authority, has a strong commitment to individual freedom, but also has a commitment to understanding equality as a kind of necessary component of being free. And then also, for that very reason, deeply opposed to capitalist social relations as well, management versus labor and so on and so forth. And this documentary, right, it's called The Anarchist, but it's really about a group of people who are anarcho-capitalists. They're the kind of libertarians that I've been talking about here, one of the central figures of whom, a man by the name of Jeff Berwick, was also involved in an effort to kind of set up sort of exit-gated communities in Chile called Gulch back in the early 2000s, which fell apart over time. People invested with Bitcoin, and it was a kind of early foray into some of these things. But so that's a show. That's a case where the question of anarcho-capitalism, part of the reason that I find it problematic is just it puts these two terms together that really shouldn't go together. And I feel like the term libertarian is also problematic, however, because in most of the world, libertarian is kind of synonymous with anarchist, or libertario, right, in Spanish. But in the case of the individuals I'm talking about, this is it's the best way for me to describe what I see as their kind of political and economic, philosophical position, and it's very prominent in the United States. So you look at the Tea Party, Rand Paul, all of whom are deeply involved in the government, but also now in the UK, or the Atlas Foundation that I was mentioning, and so forth. So I've sort of been stubborn about the term anarcho-capitalism, just because I don't like the two terms going together. But I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, you can certainly think of anarchistic versus libertarian exit societies, right, from a very small level, like a squat, right, or something like this, to sort of much larger versions of some of the communes up where I live in Ithaca, right, some of the communes in the 60s, which had their own internal hierarchies and a lot of their kinds of issues and so forth, but also ascribed to a certain kind of anti-hierarchical, anti-capitalist position. Yeah. I don't know if that helps or.
Somewhat.
Yeah.
The question was like larger in that if this is, let's say, a group, if the libertarian part is like a group of exit strategies, what are like the anarcho exit strategies that exist in the field as well?
Like, you want to know more about anarchist projects specifically rather than libertarian ones?
Well, I guess it started on like comparing the two, and then we like talk about one. So I was curious about the other.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So as I was mentioning, like some of the, you can go from a variety, right, from very sort of small, informal kinds of ones to, and even within that, right, there's a lot of kind of variation about, I'm just thinking about someone like this guy Hakeem Bey, who passed away. Peter Lamborn Wilson was his real name. Who wrote Temporary Autonomous Zone, TAZ. And the idea was actually a permanent kind of geographical exit from the state form is not feasible, right? And so the most one can hope for are moments of temporary release, temporary rebellion, temporary exit. And it could be a wide array of temporary forms, temporary autonomous zones. I think David Graeber, I think he has another, he calls it, he has another sort of play on the term temporary autonomous zone, but the idea being, rather than looking for some kind of territorial specificity and temporal longevity, that instead you find these fleeting, oftentimes repetitive moments in which you can in some form or another escape from the state. The person I mentioned previously who wrote The Network State, Balaji Srinivasan, part of his point gets to some of this a little bit, even though he's on the other end of he's on this kind of libertarian spectrum, but his point was that nation states are ideologically fluid and geographically stable. And what you want to do is reverse that, right? You want something that is geographically fluid and ideologically stable. Right? So put together communities that are ideologically stable, where people have shared commitments and so on and so forth, but they're geographically fluid because, again, the question of territoriality is such a problematic one for them. So that's a sort of variation on that from a very different kind of perspective. Yeah, sorry.
I'm just thinking, like, I think it's not necessarily productive to bring blame into issues regarding climate change, but I'm wondering, like, when you say that exit isn't a neutral act, and that it requires a great amount of privilege to leave where you are and to desire to establish this sovereignty elsewhere. I'm just wondering, like, then is it an issue of blame, or like, are we able to blame? And I think of, like, on the other hand, I think of like that Adam Curtis documentary series where it's like this sort of like hive mind, and everybody's influenced by this greater like scheme. And so I'm wondering if, like, you would consider this sort of like things like white flight or like the wealthy, expatriation being the individual's fault, or are they like led by some like higher minded sort of, are they under some kind of manipulation that causes this?
Let me ask you, which Adam Curtis documentary were you referring to? Oh, okay. Okay, I haven't seen that one. I like the All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. That one. So yeah, thanks for that question. You know, one of the things that so the book that I did is kind of around this stuff. The guy Michael Oliver I talk about, I tried, you know, pretty hard to kind of make sense of him historically and to understand sort of where he's coming from and what his experience was. And you can totally understand, right, why he would write a new constitution for a new country, what he had experienced, right, horrific, and the awareness, right, that the social situation or the political situation can turn in a heartbeat into something, you know, homicidal, genocidal. I was, let's say, not as patient with the contemporary projects that I'm looking at, in part because I think I was watching them unfold in real time in a place like Honduras. You know, I'm a Latin Americanist by training, so I teach a lot of classes on Latin America, and and so, you know, that history to me is also very pregnant and very real right here and right now. But I don't want the analysis to be one of kind of fault, right? I do want to understand where people are coming from, and you can recognize in some ways, right, when you think about something like the influence of something like Burning Man, just to take one example, right, you can see the frustration, the real frustrations that I agree with around things like, you know, unbelievably draconian, outdated, racist drug laws, right, for example, or, you know, the current attack on abortion rights. I mean, we can go through all of the sort of array of things that that for me I think are legitimate critiques of the state. You know, very profound and important legitimate critiques of the state, and the desire to find something different in some form or another. The question for me is less about kind of fault than it is about the sort of foundational problem with some of these projects, or with at least the ones that I look at, which is they are a form of white flight. I mean, it's hard not, you know, you have to consciously look away to not say that in some form it's a form of white flight. The other problem here, or at least the other issue here for me, is the refusal in a lot of the talk and a lot of the writing about these projects that are promotional of them, or that support them in some form or another, or even take a neutral position with them, is the willingness to start with premises that are completely flawed. Primitive accumulation, blood and fire expropriation of native peoples, capital accumulation through the enslavement of, you know, entire generations of Black Africans. Where do these things figure, right, in the libertarian philosophical intellectual pantheon? Nowhere. You know, and that's the thing I think that I find frustrating. I mean, Nozick, the book I mentioned by Robert Nozick, the philosopher who wrote in 1974, I mean, at least talks about reparations, right? He at least acknowledges, right, that reparations is something that needs to be kind of talked about and considered. But in so many of the sort of foundational libertarian texts, it's as if the wealth just kind of came there through working for it. There's no sense, right, of the social ways, right, in which capitalist economies and the sort of contemporary reality we live in was built. And so that's, for me, I think, more kind of my frustrations. So I just, yeah, I don't like the idea of fault or blame. I mean, I prefer, I guess, kind of cynical critique although I don't necessarily want to do that either. Thank you for the question.
We have studio at 2, so probably
yes,
I think
yeah.
we'll have to wrap up.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody on Zoom. I'm sorry I can't see you, but